Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, guests of the Valdai Club, we are starting the plenary session of the 22nd Annual Forum of the Valdai International Discussion Club. It is a great honor for me to invite the President of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, to this stage. Vladimir Vladimirovich, thank you so much for taking the time to come to us again. The Valdai Club has the incredible advantage and privilege of meeting with you and discussing the most pressing issues for the past 23 years. Probably no one can boast of this, I would venture to suggest. The 22nd meeting of the Valdai Club, which took place in the previous 3 days, had the title Polycentric World, Instructions for Use. We're trying to move from understanding and describing this very new world to some kind of applied part, that is, understanding how to live in it, because it is not very clear yet. But let's just say that we may be advanced, but only users of this world. And you're at least a mechanic, and maybe even an engineer in this most polycentric world, so we're really looking forward to hearing some instructions on how to use it. I am unlikely to be able to formulate instructions, and there is no purpose in this, because all instructions, advice, is asked, given only in order not to follow them later. This formula is well known. Let me express my opinion on what is happening in the world, where our country is, what role it plays, and how we see the prospects for development. The Valdai International Discussion Club has indeed met for the 22nd time, and such meetings have not just become a good tradition. The discussions at the Valdai venues provide an opportunity to unbiasedly and comprehensively assess the situation around the world, as they say, to record changes and make sense of them. Of course, the peculiarity and strength of the Valdai Club is the desire and ability of its members to look beyond the banal, obvious to all of us. Not to follow the agenda that the global information space imposes on us, especially since the Internet makes its contribution here. Good, bad, but sometimes difficult to understand. But to try to raise your own original questions, your vision of the processes, to lift the veil that hides tomorrow. It's not easy, but it happens, and it happens including at the Valdai playground with you and me. But we have noted more than once that we live in a time when everything is changing, and changing very quickly. I would say changing dramatically. Of course, none of us can fully foresee the future. However, this does not exempt you from the obligation to be prepared for anything that may happen. Practically, as time and recent events show, you need to be prepared for anything. Everyone's responsibility in such periods of history is especially great for their own destiny, for the fate of the country and the whole world. And the stakes are extremely high. The annual report of the Valdai Club is devoted, as has just been said, this time to the problem of a multipolar, polycentric world. This topic has been on the agenda for a long time, but now it deserves special attention. I agree with the organizers. In fact, the current multipolarity determines the framework in which states operate. I'll try to answer the question of what the specifics of the current situation are. Firstly, it is a much more open, one might even say creative space for foreign policy behavior. There is practically nothing predetermined. Everything can go in different ways. Much depends on the accuracy, degree of restraint, and thoughtfulness of the actions of each participant in international communication. And in this vast space, of course, it is easy to get lost, to lose your bearings, which, as we see, quite often happens.
Secondly, the space of multipolarity is very dynamic. Change happens quickly, as I said, and sometimes suddenly, just overnight. Of course, they are very difficult to prepare for and sometimes impossible to predict. You have to react instantly, as they say, in real time.
Thirdly, what is important is that this space is much more democratic. It opens up opportunities and the way for a large number of political and economic players. Perhaps there have never been so many countries on the world stage that influence or seek to influence the most important regional and global processes. Further, the cultural, historical, and civilizational specifics of different countries play a greater role than ever. It is necessary to look for points of contact and convergence of interests. No one is ready to play by the rules set by someone, alone, and somewhere far away. As one very famous chansoneer sang in our country, "There beyond the mists," or "There beyond the oceans." In this regard, the fifth point is that any solutions are possible only on the basis of agreements that are acceptable to all interested parties, or the vast majority. Otherwise, there will be no viable solution at all, but only loud phrases and a fruitless game of ambition. Thus, harmony and balance are needed to achieve the result. Finally, the opportunities and dangers of a multipolar world are inseparable. Of course, the weakening of the dictatorship which distinguished the previous period and the expansion of the space of freedom for all are undeniable benefits. However, in such circumstances, it is much more difficult to find and establish this most solid balance, which in itself is a clear and extreme risk. Such a situation on the planet, which I have tried to describe briefly enough, is a qualitatively new phenomenon. International relations are undergoing a radical transformation. Paradoxically, multipolarity has become a direct result of attempts to establish and maintain global hegemony, the response of the international system and history itself to the obsessive desire to build everyone into one hierarchy, at the top of which would be the countries of the West. The failure of such an undertaking was only a matter of time, which, by the way, we always talked about. And by historical standards, it happened pretty quickly, 35 years ago, when the Cold War confrontation seemed to be ending. We hoped for an era of genuine cooperation. It seemed that there were no ideological and other obstacles left that would prevent us from jointly solving problems common to humanity and regulating and resolving inevitable disputes and conflicts based on mutual respect and consideration of everyone's interests. Let me make a small historical digression here. Our country, striving to eliminate the grounds for bloc confrontation and create a common security space, has twice even declared its readiness to join NATO. The first time was in 1954, back in Soviet times, and it was done then. And the second time was during the visit of U.S. President Clinton to Moscow, as I have already said, in 2000, when we also talked about this topic. And both times we actually got rejected, and from the doorstep. I repeat, we were ready to work together, to take non-linear steps in the field of security and global stability. But our Western colleagues were not ready to free themselves from the captivity of geopolitical and historical stereotypes, from a simplified, schematic picture of the world. I also spoke publicly when Mr. Clinton and I spoke with President Clinton. He says, you know, it's interesting. I think it's possible. And then in the evening he says, I consulted with my own people. It's unrealistic. It's unrealistic now. And when is it real? That's it. It's all gone. In short, we all had a real chance for a different positive vector in the development of international relations. But alas, a different approach took over. Western countries could not resist the temptation of absolute power. The temptation is serious. In order to resist this temptation, it was necessary to have in mind a historical perspective and a good level of training, including intellectual training, historical training. Those who made decisions back then, apparently, simply did not have such training. Yes, the power of the United States and its allies reached its peak at the end of the 20th century, but there is not and will not be a force that would be able to control the world, prescribe to everyone what to do and how to breathe. There were attempts, but they all ended in failure. At the same time, it is worth noting that many people found the so-called liberal world order acceptable, even convenient in some ways. Yes, hierarchy limits the possibilities of those who are not on the upper floors of the pyramid, if I may, at the top of the food chain, but live somewhere there, at its foot. But this situation removes a significant share of responsibility from them. What are the rules? Just accept the terms offered, integrate into the system, get your share, and be happy. Don't think about anything. Others will think and decide for you. And no matter what they say, no matter who's trying to hide there right now. And so it really was. And the experts who are sitting here remember and understand all this very well. Some smugly considered themselves entitled to teach everyone else. Others preferred to play along with the strong, to be an obedient object of trade and exchange, in order to avoid unnecessary problems and get their bonus, albeit small, but confident. By the way, there are enough such politicians in the old part of the world, in Europe, even now. Those who objected, tried to defend their interests, rights, and views were considered at best, so to speak, carefully, cranks, hinted, anyway, nothing will work out for you. Better accept it, admit that you are nothing against our power, an empty place. Well, the self-proclaimed world grandees brought up the very obstinate ones, no longer shy about anything, and thus made it clear to everyone that resistance was useless. It didn't lead to anything good. None of the world's problems have been solved, but more and more are constantly being added. The institutions of global governance created in the previous era either do not work at all or have largely lost their effectiveness, either this way or that way. And no matter how much potential an individual country or group of countries has accumulated, there are limits to any power. The Russian side, the audience knows, we have such a popular expression. There is no trick against scrap except for other scrap. And he always shows up, you know? This is the essence of what is happening in the world always. It always appears. In addition, an attempt to control everything and everyone around creates an overstrain, and it affects internal stability, causing legitimate questions from citizens of countries that are trying to play this role of grandees. Why do we need all this? In addition, an attempt to control everything and everyone around creates an overstrain, and it affects internal stability, causing legitimate questions from citizens of countries that are trying to play this role of grandees. Why do we need all this? In the societies of the leading Western European states, a clear rejection of the exorbitant ambitions of the political elite of these countries has matured and is growing. The barometer of public opinion shows this everywhere. The establishment does not want to cede power, goes to direct deception of its own citizens, escalates the situation on the external circuit, goes to any tricks inside their countries, increasingly on the verge, or even beyond the law. But endlessly turning democratic and electoral procedures into a farce, manipulating the will of the peoples, will not work. Let's say it was like in Romania, but we won't go into details. This is happening in many countries, and in some countries they are trying to ban their political opponents, who are already gaining greater legitimacy and greater trust from the electorate. We know this. We were in the Soviet Union. Do you remember Vysotsky's songs? Even the military parade was canceled. They'll be f***ing banned soon. But it doesn't work. The bans don't work. And the will of the people, the will of the citizens of these countries is simple. Let the leaders of the countries deal with the problems of citizens, take care of their safety and quality of life, and not chase after chimeras. The United States, where people's demands have led to a sufficiently radical change in the political vector, is a clear example of this. And for other countries, we can say that the examples are known to be contagious. The subordination of the majority to the minority, inherent in international relations during the period of Western domination, is giving way to a multilateral, more cooperative approach. It is based on the agreements of the leading players and consideration of the interests of all. Of course, this does not guarantee harmony and absolute non-conflict. The interests of countries never completely coincide, and the whole history of international relations is, of course, a struggle for their realization. But the fundamentally new global atmosphere, the tone of which is increasingly being set by the countries of the world majority, allows us to hope that all players will somehow have to take into account each other's interests when developing solutions to regional and global problems. After all, in fact, no one can achieve their goals alone, in isolation from others. Despite the intensification of conflicts, the crisis of the previous model of globalization, and the fragmentation of the global economy, the world remains integral, interconnected, and interdependent.
We know this from our own experience. You know how much effort our opponents have put into recent years to, roughly speaking, kick Russia out of the global system, drive us into political, cultural, informational isolation, and economic autarky. In terms of the number and volume of punitive measures imposed against us, which are shamefully called sanctions, Russia is an absolute record holder in world history. 30,000, and maybe even more, than any restrictions.
So what? Have you achieved your goal? I think there's no need to explain to those present here that these efforts have failed completely. Russia has shown the world the highest degree of resilience, the ability to withstand the strongest external pressure that could break not only an individual country, but an entire coalition of states. And we feel, of course, legitimate pride in this regard. Pride for Russia, for our citizens, and for our armed forces. But I want to say more than that. It turned out that the very world system from which they wanted to expel us, squeeze us out, simply won't let Russia go, because she needs Russia as a very significant part of the global balance. And not only because of its territory, population, defense, technological, and industrial potential, because of its minerals. Although, of course, everything that I have just listed is very, very important. These are the most important factors. But first of all, because the world balance cannot be built without Russia, neither economically, nor strategically, nor culturally, nor logistically. I think that those who tried to destroy all this have just become convinced of this. Some, however, stubbornly hope to achieve their goal, to inflict, as they say, a strategic defeat on Russia. Well, if they don't see the doom of this plan and persist, I still hope that life will show and it will reach the most stubborn, slow-witted. It seems that they had already made noise more than once, threatened with a complete blockade, tried to force the people of Russia, as they themselves put it. They chose the word. They were not ashamed. They wanted to make the people of Russia suffer. They made plans, one more fantastic than the other. It seems to me that it's time to calm down, look around, understand the realities, and somehow build relationships in a completely different direction. We also understand that the polycentric world is very dynamic. It seems fragile and unstable because it is impossible to fix the situation forever, to determine the balance of power for a long time. After all, there are many participants in the processes, and these forces are very asymmetrical and complexly composed. Everyone has their own winning sides and competitive advantages, which in each case create a unique combination and composition. Today's world is an extremely complex, multi-dimensional system, and to properly describe and comprehend it, simple laws of logic, cause and effect relationships, and the resulting patterns are not enough. We need a philosophy of complexity here, something akin to quantum mechanics, which is wiser and more complex than classical physics. However, it is precisely due to this complexity of the world that, in my opinion, the general negotiability tends to increase. After all, linear, unilateral solutions are impossible, and nonlinear and multilateral solutions require very serious, professional, unbiased, creative, and at times unconventional diplomacy. Therefore, I am convinced that you and I will witness a kind of renaissance, the revival of high diplomatic art, and its essence lies in the ability to conduct a dialogue and negotiate with neighbors, like-minded people, and, no less important but more difficult, with opponents. It is in this spirit, the spirit of 21st century diplomacy, that new institutions are developing. This includes the expanding BRICS community, as well as organizations from the largest regions, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and Eurasia, and more compact, but no less important regional associations. There are many of them around the world right now. I won't list them all. You know about it. All these new structures are different, but they share the most important quality. They do not function according to the principle of hierarchy, subordination to one person, the most important. They are not against anyone. They are for themselves. I repeat once again, the modern world needs agreements, not the imposition of someone's will. Any hegemony simply cannot and will not cope with the scale of the tasks. Ensuring international security in these conditions is an extremely urgent and complex issue. The growing number of players with different goals and political cultures, with their own distinctive traditions, all this global complexity makes developing approaches to the topic of security a much more confusing and difficult task. However, it also opens up new opportunities for all of us. Blocky habits, deliberately programmed for confrontation, are certainly now an anachronism that makes no sense. We see, for example, with what diligence our European neighbors strive to patch and plaster the cracks that have gone through the building of Europe.
However, they want to overcome the split and strengthen the shaken unity that they used to boast about, not by effectively solving internal problems, but by inflating the image of the enemy. It's an old example, but the trick is that people in these countries see and understand everything. Therefore, they take to the streets, despite the escalation, as I have already said, of the situation on the outer contour and the search for this enemy. Moreover, they are recreating a familiar enemy that was invented centuries ago, Russia. Most people in Europe cannot understand why they are so afraid of Russia, that in order to confront it, they need to tighten their belts tighter and tighter and forget about their own interests, just surrender them, and pursue a policy clearly to their detriment. But the ruling elites of the United Europe continue to whip up hysteria. It turns out that the war with the Russians is almost on the threshold. They repeat this nonsense, this mantra, over and over again. I'm telling you honestly, sometimes I look at how and what they say and I think, well, they can't believe it. They can't believe what they're saying. That Russia is going to attack NATO? It's unbelievable. And they convince their people. So what kind of people are they? They are either very incompetent if they really believe, because it is impossible to believe in this nonsense, or they are simply not decent because they do not believe in it themselves, and they are trying to convince their citizens of this. What other options are there? To be honest, I just want to say, calm down, sleep well, and finally, take care of your problems. Look at what is happening on the streets of European cities, what is happening to the economy, industry, European culture and identity, huge debts, and the growing crisis of social security systems, out-of-control migration, increased violence, including political violence, radicalization of leftists, ultra-liberal, racist, marginal societies. Notice how Europe is sliding into the periphery of global competition. We are well aware of how all the threats regarding Russia's aggressive plans, which Europe is using to intimidate itself, have been sucked out of its fingers, as I have just said. But auto-suggestion is a dangerous thing, and we simply cannot ignore what is happening, and we have no right to do so for reasons of ensuring our own security, and I repeat, our defense and security. Therefore, we are closely following the growing militarization of Europe. Are these just words, or is it time for us to take retaliatory measures? We hear, and you know about it, that Germany, for example, says that the German army should again be the most powerful in Europe. All right, we're listening carefully, looking at what's meant. I think there is no doubt that Russia's retaliatory measures will not take long to come. The response to the threats, to put it mildly, will be very convincing. Exactly the answer. We have never initiated a military confrontation ourselves. It is meaningless, unnecessary, and simply absurd. It leads away from real problems and challenges, and societies will sooner or later be held accountable by their leaders for ignoring their hopes, aspirations, and needs by these elites in their countries. But if someone still has a desire to compete with us in the military sphere, as we say, free will, let them try. Russia has repeatedly proved that when there is a threat to our security, the peace and tranquility of our citizens, our sovereignty, and statehood itself, we respond quickly. No need to provoke. There has never been a case where, in the end, it did not end badly for the provocateur himself. There is no need to wait for exceptions here in the future. There will be none. Our history has proved that weakness is unacceptable because it creates the temptation, the illusion that some issue with us can be solved with the help of force. Russia will never show weakness and indecision. Let those whom we disturb by the very fact of our existence remember this. Those who cherish dreams of inflicting this very strategic defeat on us. By the way, those who actively talked about it, as we also say, there are no others. But those are far away. Where are these figures? There are so many objective problems related to natural, man-made, and social factors in the world that it is unacceptable, wasteful, and simply stupid to expend effort and energy on artificial, often contrived contradictions. International security is now such a multifaceted and indivisible phenomenon that no amount of geopolitical value division can split it. Only painstaking, comprehensive work involving different partners and relying on creative approaches can solve the complex security equations of the 21st century. And there are no more or less important elements in it. No particularly important ones. Everything is solved only in a complex. Our country has consistently defended and defends the principle of indivisibility of security. I have said more than once that the safety of some cannot be ensured at the expense of others. Otherwise, there is no security at all. There is no security for anyone. It was not possible to achieve the approval of such a principle. The euphoria and unlimited thirst for power of those who considered themselves winners after the Cold War, as I have said many times, led to the desire to impose one-sided, subjective ideas about security on everyone. This, in fact, has become the true root cause of not only the Ukrainian, but also many other acute conflicts of the 20th, first decade of the 21st century. As a result, as we warned, no one feels safe at all today. It's time to return, as they say, to the roots, to correct the mistakes made. But the indivisibility of security today, if compared with the late 80s and early 90s of the last century, is an even more complex phenomenon. This is not just about military political balance and consideration of mutual interests. The security of mankind depends on its ability to respond to the challenges posed by natural disasters, man-made disasters, technological development, and new rapid social, demographic, and information processes. All this is interconnected, and changes occur largely by themselves, often, as I have already said, unpredictably, according to their own internal logic and laws, and sometimes even, let me say, against the will and expectations of people. Humanity runs the risk of being superfluous in such a situation, just an observer of processes that it will no longer be able to control. What is this but a systemic challenge for all of us, and an opportunity for all of us to work constructively together? There are no ready-made answers here, but I believe that in order to solve global problems, it is necessary, first, to approach them without ideological commitment, without edifying pathos, in the spirit of, now I will explain everything to you properly. Secondly, it is important to realize that this is a truly common, indivisible cause that requires the joint work of all countries and peoples. Every culture and civilization must contribute because, I repeat, no one knows the right answer individually. It can be born only in conditions of joint constructive search, unification, and not separation of efforts and national experience of different states. I repeat once again, conflicts of interests
have been and will be, of course, have always been and will always be. The question is how to solve them. A multipolar world, as I have already said today, is the return of classical diplomacy, when a settlement requires attention, mutual respect, and not coercion. Classical diplomacy was able to take into account the position of different subjects of international life, the very complexity of the concert of various powers. However, at one time it was replaced by the Western diplomacy of monologue, endless teachings, and orders. Instead of resolving conflict situations, someone's specific interests began to be pushed through, considering the interests of everyone else unworthy of attention. Is it any wonder that instead of a settlement, the result was only an escalation of conflicts, right up to their transition into a bloody armed phase and a humanitarian catastrophe? Acting like this won't solve a single problem. There are countless examples over 30 years. One of them is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which, according to the recipes of Western unilateral diplomacy, which grossly ignores the history, traditions, identity, and culture of the peoples living there, cannot be resolved, as well as the overall stabilization of the situation in the Middle East, which, on the contrary, is rapidly deteriorating. We are now getting to know President Trump's initiatives in more detail. It seems to me that there may still be some light at the end of the tunnel. The Ukrainian tragedy is a terrible example. It's a pain for Ukrainians and for Russians, for all of us. The causes of the Ukrainian conflict are well known to anyone who has taken the trouble to inquire about the background of its current, most acute stage. I won't repeat it. I'm sure those present in this room know them well and know my position on this issue. I have formulated it many times. Other things are also known. Those who encouraged, goaded, armed Ukraine, incited it to Russia, and nurtured rabid nationalism and neo-Nazism there for decades. To be honest, sorry for the hype, they didn't care not only about Russian interests, but also about the actual Ukrainian, genuine interests of the people of this country. They don't feel sorry for these people. These people are expendable for them, for globalists, expansionists in the West, and their servants in Kiev. The results of reckless adventurism are obvious. There's nothing to talk about. You can ask yourself another question. Could it have been otherwise? We also know, and I'll go back to what President Trump said. He said that if he had been in power, this could have been avoided. I agree with that. Indeed, this could have been avoided if our work with the then Biden administration had been structured differently. If Ukraine had not been turned into a destructive tool in the wrong hands, if the North Atlantic Bloc, which is advancing towards our borders, had not been used for this, if Ukraine had retained in the end its independence, its real sovereignty. And another question, how should the bilateral Russian-Ukrainian problems be resolved, which were an objective consequence of the collapse of a huge country and complex geopolitical transformations? By the way, I think that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was also connected with the position of the then Russian leadership to get rid of any ideological confrontation in the hope that now, when everything is over with communism, fraternization will now come. No, nothing like that. It turns out that there are other factors here, as well as geopolitical interests, and it turned out that ideological contradictions had nothing to do with it. How to solve them in a polycentric world, and how would the situation in Ukraine be resolved? I think that if there were multipolarity,
the different poles would try on the situation around the Ukrainian conflict, as they say, for themselves, for those potential tension zones, faults that exist in their own regions. And then a collective decision would be much more responsible and balanced. A settlement would be based on the understanding that all participants in this difficult situation have their own interests. They are justified by objective and subjective circumstances, and they cannot be ignored. The desire of all countries to ensure security and development is legitimate. This naturally applies to Ukraine, Russia, and all our neighbors. It is the states of the region that should have the main say in creating a regional system, and they are the ones who have the best chance to agree on a model of interaction acceptable to all, because it directly concerns them. This is their life interest. For other countries, this situation, in this case in Ukraine, is a map in another much larger game, and in their own game, and as a rule, not even related to the specific problems of countries in general, and in this case, this particular country and the countries involved in the conflict. This is just an excuse and a way to solve your geopolitical problems, expand your control zone, and earn a little money from the war. So they climbed on our doorstep with the NATO infrastructure, and for years they looked blankly at the tragedy of Donbass, at the genocide and the extermination of the Russian people in our ancestral historical territories, which began in 2014 after the bloody coup in Ukraine. In contrast to this behavior, which is demonstrated by Europe and, until recently, the United States under the previous administration, are the actions of the world's majority countries. They refuse to take sides and strive to really help establish a just peace. We are grateful to all the states that have sincerely made efforts in recent years to find a way out of the situation. These are our founding partners of the BRICS: China, India, Brazil, South Africa. This is Belarus and, by the way, North Korea. These are our friends in the Arab and Islamic world in general. First of all, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, and Iran, Serbia, Hungary, Slovakia in Europe, and many other countries, African and Latin American. Unfortunately, it has not been possible to stop the fighting so far, but the responsibility for this lies not with the majority for what has not been stopped, but with the minority, primarily Europe, which is constantly escalating the conflict. And, in my opinion, there is no other goal there today. Nevertheless, I think that goodwill will prevail, and in this sense, there is not the slightest doubt. I think that changes are taking place in Ukraine gradually, as we see it. No matter how people are brainwashed, changes are still taking place in the public consciousness and in the vast majority of countries around the world. In fact, the phenomenon of the global majority is a new phenomenon in international life. I would also like to say a few words about this. What is its essence? The fact is that the vast majority of the world states are determined to realize their own civilizational interests, the main of which is their balanced, progressive development. It would seem that this is natural. It has always been so. But in previous eras, the understanding of these very interests was often distorted by unhealthy ambitions, selfishness, and the influence of expansionist ideology. Now, the majority of countries and peoples, the very majority of the world, are aware of their true interests. But the most important thing is that they feel the strength and confidence to defend these interests despite external influences.
And I would add that by promoting and defending their own interests, they are ready to work together with partners, that is, to transform international relations, diplomacy, and integration into a source of their growth, progress, and development. Relations within the global majority are the prototype of political practices that are necessary and effective in a polycentric world. These are pragmatism and realism, the rejection of the bloc philosophy, the absence of strict obligations set by one person, models where there are senior and junior partners. Finally, the ability to combine interests that do not always coincide, but mostly do not contradict each other. The absence of antagonism becomes the basic principle. Now a new wave of de facto decolonization is gaining momentum when former colonies, in addition to statehood, acquire political, economic, cultural, and ideological sovereignty. In this context, another anniversary is significant. We have just celebrated the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. It is not only the most representative, universal political structure in the world, it is a symbol of the spirit of cooperation, alliance, even military brotherhood, which helped in the first half of the last century to unite efforts to fight the most terrible evil in history, the ruthless machine of extermination and enslavement. And the decisive role in this common victory, we are proud of it. The victory over Nazism belongs, of course, to the Soviet Union. We just need to look at the number of victims of all the participants in the anti-Hitler coalition, and everything will become immediately clear. That's all. The United Nations, of course, is the legacy of the victory in World War II, and the most successful experience so far in creating an international organization within which it is possible to solve pressing global problems. Nowadays, one often hears that the UN system is paralyzed and in crisis. It has become a commonplace. Some even argue that it has outlived its usefulness, and it should at least be radically reformed. Yes, of course, there are a lot of problems in the work of the United Nations, a lot. But there is also nothing better than the UN yet. This must also be acknowledged. The problem is not really with the UN, because its potential is very large. The real question is how we ourselves, the United Nations that are now unfortunately divided, use all these opportunities. There is no doubt that the UN is facing difficulties. Like any organization, today it needs to adapt to changing realities. However, in the process of its reform and completion, it is fundamentally important not to lose or distort the basic meaning, not only that which was laid down during the creation of the entire United Nations, but also acquired in the process of its complex development. In this regard, it is worth remembering that since 1945, the number of UN member states has almost quadrupled. The organization, which arose on the initiative of several major countries, has not only expanded over the decades of its existence, it has absorbed many different cultures and political traditions, gained diversity, and turned into a truly multipolar one, long before the world became like this. The potential inherent in the UN system is just beginning to unfold, and I am sure that this will happen, and will happen, faster in the coming new era. In other words, now the countries of the global majority are naturally forming a convincing majority in the United Nations, which means that its structure and governing bodies should be brought into line with this fact, which, by the way, will be much more consistent with the basic principles of democracy. I will not deny that there is currently no consensus on how the world should be organized, on what principles it should be based in the coming years and decades. We have entered a long period of searching, largely by touch. It is unknown when a new stable system and its framework will be finally formed. We must be prepared that for a long time, social, political, and economic development will be difficult to predict, and sometimes very nervous.
Сохранить четкие ориентиры, не сбиться с пути, всем нужна прочная опора.
And in order to keep clear guidelines and not lose their way, everyone needs a solid foothold. In our opinion, these are primarily values that have been maturing in national cultures for centuries: culture and history, ethical and religious norms, the influence of geography and space are the main elements from which civilizations are born, special communities that have been created over the centuries and define national identity, values, and traditions, all that serve as landmarks that allow you not to get lost, to withstand the storms of the stormy ocean of international life. Traditions are always a unique, original thing. Everyone has their own. And respect for traditions is the first and main condition for the successful development of international relations and solving emerging problems. The world has experienced attempts at unification, the imposition of a supposedly universal model that ran counter to the cultural and ethical traditions of most peoples. At one time, the Soviet Union sinned by imposing its own political system. We are aware of this. To be honest, I don't think anyone will argue. Then the United States took over the baton. Europe was also very different. In both cases, nothing worked out. The superficial, the alluvial, the artificial, especially the imposed from the outside, does not hold for a long time. And those who respect their tradition, as rule, do not encroach on someone else's. Now, against the background of international instability, special attention is being paid to its own development foundation, which does not depend on international whirlwinds. And we see how countries and peoples are turning to these very foundations. This happens not only in the countries of the world majority, but also in Western societies. If everyone is guided by this, taking care of themselves, and not wasting time on unnecessary ambitions, it turns out that it is easier to find a common language with others. The current experience of Russia's cooperation with the United States can be cited as an example. As you know, our countries have many contradictions, and our views on many global issues do not converge. For such major powers, this is normal, in fact, absolutely natural. The main thing is how to resolve these contradictions, as far as possible, to settle them peacefully. The current White House administration declares its interests and desires directly. I think you will agree with me. Sometimes bluntly, but without any unnecessary hypocrisy. It is always better to clearly understand what the interlocutor wants, what he is trying to achieve, than to try to guess the real meaning in a series of equivocation, ambiguous and vague hints. We see that the current U.S. administration is guided primarily by the interests of its own country as it understands them. I think this is a rational approach. But then, I'm sorry, Russia reserves the right to be guided by our national interests, one of which, by the way, is the restoration of full-fledged relations with the United States. And no matter what the contradictions are, if you treat each other with respect, then bargaining, even the toughest, most persistent, will still aim to come together, which means that, in the end, mutually acceptable solutions are possible. Multipolarity, polycentrism, the reality that is with us for a long time, How soon and how effectively we will be able to create a stable world order on its basis depends on each of us. And such an order, such a model in the modern world is possible only as a result of universal efforts, work in which everyone participates. I repeat, the days when a narrow group of the most powerful powers decided for the rest of the world how to live are gone forever.
Об этом стоит помнить тем, кто ностальгирует по колониальным временам, когда народы
This should be remembered by those who are nostalgic for the colonial times, when it was customary to divide nations into those who are equal and some who are more equal. Orwell's phrase is well known to us. It has never been peculiar to us, Russia, to have such a racist understanding of problems, such an attitude towards other peoples, other cultures, has never been peculiar to Russia and never will be. We are for diversity, polyphony, and a symphony of values. The world, of course, you will agree with me, looks dull when it is monotonous. Russia has had a very stormy and difficult fate. The very formation of Russian statehood is a constant overcoming of colossal historical challenges. I don't want to say that other countries have developed in greenhouse conditions. Of course not. Nevertheless, the Russian experience is unique in many ways, as is the country it created. There is no claim to exclusivity or superiority in this. It is just a statement of our identity. We have experienced numerous shocks, and we have given the world food for very different thoughts, both negative and positive. But thanks to our historical baggage, we are better prepared for the complex, non-linear, ambiguous global situation in which we all have to live. In all the twists and turns, Russia has proved one thing. It was, is, and always will be. Her role in the world is changing. We understand that. But she remains a force without which it is difficult and often impossible to achieve harmony or balance. This proven fact, proven by history, time, is a fact that is unconditional.
Но в сегодняшнем многополярном мире эта гармония, этот баланс, о которых я говорю,
But in today's multipolar world, this harmony, this balance, which I mentioned, can be achieved, of course, only as a result of joint common work. And I want to assure you that Russia is ready for such work. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.